So first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here to present one of my essays of my dissertation. So, well, before talking about my paper, let me briefly talk about myself. So before joining the PhD program, I used to work as a fixed income analyst. Okay, so it's interesting to say that when I entered in the program, I had the feeling that I would work with fixed income and also derivatives, things that were close to my professional background. But since then, I got involved with different things like corporate finance and even other things like international finance and private equity. And now I had the opportunity to be back with my roots. I have this work here, which is somehow connected to fixed income. That's a corporate governance topic, but I mean, I work with fixed income. I'm going to talk about that in a while. And also more recently, I also had the opportunity to be connected with my roots again, working with hedge funds. So it's interesting to mention that because eventually when you enter in the program, you feel that you're going to work with things that are related to your professional background, and somehow you got involved with different things, right? So great. So let me briefly talk about my essay, which basically investigate the impact of stock buybacks on bondholders. Okay. So, and the motivation about that is basically, like I said, when I used to work in the industry, I used to see a lot of articles like that. Okay, for example, Financial Times, bondholders pay price of share buybacks, and here, as you guys can see, I have a part of the article that basically summarizes why we think that stock buybacks will basically impact the bondholders. As you guys can see, as companies add the leverage to boost their stock price, the higher debt load combined with slower growth expectations may lead to credit downgrades and potential decline in the price of their bonds. So that basically summarizes why people in the financial market industry think that maybe stock buybacks can be bad for the bondholders, okay? And the researchers have been long been interested in whether stock buybacks affected bondholders. The first work was then 1981. And however, the evidence we have so far is mixed. Maxwell and Stephens 2003 found evidence supportive of wealth transfer from bondholders to shareholders, but more recent work found evidence inconsistent with wealth transfer hypotheses. And the point is, the prior studies have paid limited attention to influence of corporate governance characteristics of buybacks. And the reason why that is important, I'm going to talk about that in a while, is because eventually stock buybacks will convey good information for the firm as a whole, and which can be good for both shareholder and also the bondholder, but also for but eventually the stock buybacks will also convey bad information for bondholders because, like I said, maybe that is going to increase the financial leverage of the firm, and that can be bad for the firm. So I need to find mechanisms to disentangle, to separate the bad impact or the positive impact from the negative impacts to the shareholder, to the bondholders. So that's what I intend to do right here. I use governance to do that, to separate the good impact from the bad impact, you see? So let me briefly talk, of course, I mean, like I said, I just have 15 minutes to present this paper, so I promise that I'm gonna be very brief with the little review. So, so let me briefly talk about the hypothesis why the firms conduct the stock buyback. So firm repurchase stock buybacks for fundamental and non-fundamental reasons. And fundamental reasons are those reasons based on the fundamentals of the buyback firms, like to exploit temporary stock undervaluation, to signal positive prospects, to transfer wealth from bondholders to shareholder, which is related to my research, to distribute excess cash when the firm lacks future growth opportunities, for price support, as a takeover deterrence, and to adjust financial leverage, which somehow also connected with the wealth transfer hypothesis. And finally, we have the non-fundamental reasons, like the name suggests, reasons not based on the fundamentals of the company. So, for example, we have the hypothesis that firms conduct buyback for managerial compensation, to meet analyst consensus earnings per share estimates, and due to CEO overconfidence. And also, the point is, we have evidence that the increase of repurchase driven by non-fundamental reasons in recent periods reduced the abnormal return of stocks surrounded by buyback announcements, okay? So basically, like I said, we have the signaling hypothesis that suggests that buyback convey good information to the firm as a whole. This hypothesis includes various reasons why firms conducted buybacks. So, and you also have the wealth transfer hypothesis, which basically suggests that stock buybacks increase the debt to equity ratio, increasing the debt of cost. And in this case, stock buybacks decrease assets in which bondholders have higher claim compared to the shareholders. So basically here we have one hypothesis that is going to convey good information for the firm as a whole, and the other hypothesis that suggests that stock buybacks will convey good information for the shareholders and bad information for the bondholders, okay? So if I could illustrate both hypotheses, that's what I would have, okay? So right here, let me try to use my pen just to highlight the points I'm talking about. So, oops, not this one, just a second. So the laser. Okay, so as you can see, the signaling hypothesis suggests that surrounding the buyback announcements, the bond abnormal returns and stock abnormal returns will be positively associated, okay? And the wealth transfer hypothesis suggests that surrounding the buyback announcements, the bond abnormal returns and stock abnormal returns will be negatively associated. So that's the point I have right here. So I need to find ways to disentangle. Ooh, I don't know what happens. Oh, here back. So can you, okay, great. So I need to find a way to disentangle these two effects, okay? So then I can go to my first hypothesis. So basically, well, I have only 15 minutes to present. So again, I'm just running here. So having stronger shareholder governance could be positive or negative to the bondholder. So stronger governance mechanisms reduce concerns associated with false signaling and lends credibility to firms announcing buybacks. However, stronger shareholder control combined with takeover vulnerability increase the cost of that. So which leads us to my first two hypotheses, right? The first one states that there is a positive association between abnormal stock and bond returns as stock repurchase announcement made by firms with stronger shareholder governance, which is related to the signaling hypothesis, okay? The second one states that there is a negative association between abnormal stock and bond returns as stock repurchase announcement made by firm with stronger shareholder governance, which is related to the wealth transfer hypothesis. So again, if I could illustrate my first set of hypotheses, that's what I would have. As you guys can see, the first hypothesis suggests that basically the line will, the governance mechanism will steepen the curve, okay? And the second one suggests that the governance mechanism will actually flatten the curve, okay? So my second hypothesis related to the shareholder and bondholder conflict, and shareholder and bondholder conflicts exacerbate the propensity of shareholders to expropriate bondholders' wealth through increased dividend payment. So in this case, I also try to propose to examine whether shareholder and bondholder conflict could be a very good mechanism to disentangle the two positive and negative effects as well. So that's what I have in my second hypothesis that states that shareholder and bondholder conflicts increase the wealth transfer effect of stock repurchase announcement. And finally, I have also my hypothesis related to the executive compensation. So firms with executive compensation linked to stock performance are more likely to conduct the stock buybacks. So in this case, I have my third hypothesis that suggests that there is a stronger evidence of wealth transfer effect and weaker evidence of signal effect surrounding stock repurchase announcement when managers have their compensation tied to stock performance. And finally, I mean, whenever we talk about bonds, we need to investigate covenants, okay? And covenants align shareholders and bondholders' interests and reduce bondholders' concern associated with stronger shareholder governance mechanisms. In contrast, the presence of distribution covenants in that contract may encourage firms to engage in stock buybacks to bypass the covenant restriction. So right here, I have two hypotheses. The first one suggests that there is a weaker evidence wealth transfer effects and stronger evidence of signal effects surrounding stock repurchase announcements for bonds with non-distribution covenants. And finally, I investigate whether firms may use stock buybacks to bypass the covenants related to dividend payments, okay, which is my hypothesis 5. So bond returns and signal effects around the stock repurchase announcements are lower in bonds with distribution covenants. Okay, data source. So I use a bunch of data source. So SDC for merger and acquisition, Trace for bonds information, merge fees data set for information about the bonds in terms of ratings and maturities and covenants, ISS for governance information, Thomson Reuters for institutional ownership, CompuStat and CRISP for company for the accounting and stock information, Execon Comp for option information, and proxy statements. So I analyze the proxy statement to examine whether the executives have their compensation linked to the earnings per share. Okay, so the Trace data set starts its coverage 2003. Therefore, my sample covers the period between 2003 and the end of 2020. Okay, so like I said, I measure governance variable using different methodologies, but right here for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to show you the difference between internal governance measure and also the external governance measure. So basically to measure internal governance, I use 3 characteristics, like the size of the board of directors, the proportion of outside directors on the board, and institutional ownership. So the sample sort in the quartile based on the 3 internal governance measures. Next, the quartiles are added up in a given year. And I have this measure right here where basically the strong governance level has the value closer to 1, and the weaker governance level has the value closer to 0.25, okay? And I do exactly the same for the external governance measure. So I use the entity cover provision by using the index by Babishuk et al. 2009. So I converted that in a way that a higher external governance measure is related to the better external governance. Okay, so that's the reason why I use 6 minus the E index divided by 6, right? Like I said, I use other methodologies as well, but again, my time is limited here. So that's what I'm going to show you guys today, right? In terms of covenants, I use 4 types of covenants. The first one is the financing covenants, designed to prevent the company from issuing additional debt or equity. Event-driven covenants, designed to protect bondholders from events like rating downgrades and cross defaults. Investment restriction covenants, designed to limit certain risk investment activities like merger and acquisitions. And finally, distribution restriction covenants, designed to restrict the company's capacity to make some distribution to shareholders like dividends. So, okay, so how do I plan to measure the cumulative abnormal bond return? So basically right here, I have the bond return, and then the bond return is going to be equal to the cumulative abnormal bond return is going to be equal to the bond return minus the benchmark, okay? And as a benchmark, I use a self-constructed evaluated index of daily bond returns for each major credit rating category, and also the 16 Bloomberg Barclays Fixed Income Index as robust as check, okay? All right, so here I'm probably going to show you what you guys are interested. Okay, the model. So to test the impact of governance strength on the wealth transfer and signal effect, I use a OLS model where the cumulative abnormal bond return is the dependent variable. I have the cumulative abnormal stock return as independent variable. The governance measure right here, and right here is my variable of interest, which is the interaction term between the governance measure and the cumulative abnormal stock return. By the way, here is also important to mention that the signaling hypothesis suggests that this coefficient right here is going to be positive, and the wealth transfer hypothesis suggests that this coefficient here is going to be negative, okay? To test the impact of shareholder-bondholder conflict, sample separated in quartiles based on the level of conflict. So like the rating, financial leverage, CEO ownership, of cash flow and dividends, and also examine this hypothesis looking to the downgrades and upgrades in terms of rating. So I will not show here in this presentation, otherwise I wouldn't have time. So, okay, so let me briefly talk about my sample. I have around 1,300 observations. So, well, what is interesting to mention here is that around 80% of the firms I considered investment grades. So what else? Well, that's what I would say that is important to mention here as well. So maybe something that's important to mention is the mean in terms of external governance. The mean is equal to 0.57, and the mean for the internal governance is equal to 0.60. Like I said, the minimal valuable forcible for the internal governance is equal to 0.25, and the maximum is equal to 1. Okay. So, all right. So right here, as you guys can see, basically I have univariate regression, basically just showing you the cumulative abnormal stock return surrounding the buyback announcements using different time periods, event windows. So as you guys can see, the cumulative abnormal stock return is always positive and statistically significant. Okay. So right here, I have the t-test, okay, the t-statistics. So as you guys can see, always positive and abnormal, statistically significant. But I mean, for the bonds, I don't have exactly the same thing. The values are pretty close to zero, and almost not statistically significant. Okay, for the cumulative abnormal bond return. So okay, so now I have my first multivariate regression, and as you guys can see, so basically without controlling for the governance mechanisms, the stock and the bond return is always positive and statistically significant in all the event windows analyzed. Okay, so it's also, I mean, again, I'm going to emphasize that right here, I'm not controlling for the governance. Okay. And once I start controlling for the governance, I see like a very interesting thing happening, that the cumulative abnormal stock return becomes negative. And however, the interaction term becomes positive, which means that maybe the positive relationship between stock and bond returns surrounding the buyback announcement is dependent on the level of governance in the repurchasing firm. Okay. And I also like to mention that right here, I'm only using 3 event windows, okay, because I just want to show you that simplify the presentation. But in the paper, I use all the windows that I had before, these windows right here, okay? So when I control for the external governance, I don't have exactly the same thing. So basically, nothing happens with the return, the relationship between a stock return and the bond return surrounding the buyback announcement. And right here in this regression, I control for both external and internal governance, okay? And I have exactly the same thing that I had before. So the interaction term is still positive and statistically significant. And as you guys can see here, the cumulative abnormal stock return is negative and statistically significant, okay? So it's also important to mention that the minimum value possible for internal governance is equal to 0.25. So for example, if the firm has a value equal to 0.25, it's not going to be different from 0, this interaction term, the sum of these two estimates right here, okay? Which means that I found no evidence of wealth transfer hypothesis, even in the firm with the weakest shareholder governance. So finally, like I said, I have so many other tables in my papers, but I wouldn't have time. So right here, I analyze the importance of the covenant. And as you guys can see, if they're bonds, it is a bond level. So I have more observation on this regression right here. So the presence of the finance covenant actually mitigates the positive association between stock and bond returns around the announcement, as you guys can see right here. Okay, so it's the relationship. Actually, it's this interaction term, the estimate for this interaction term is negative and statistically significant when I analyze financing covenant, okay, the presence of the finance covenant. So, however, I mean, here is important to mention that the estimate for internal governance, the interaction term of internal governance with stock return remains positive and statistically significant, which means that the presence, I mean, the level of internal governance is important even when you control for the presence of financial for the covenants or not. Here, financing covenant, investment driven, I mean, event covenants. Okay, no, actually, event driven covenants, investment covenants, and distribution covenants. Okay, all right. Main find is the positive relation between stock and bond returns dependent on the governance strength in the repurchasing firms. Results are consistent with the hypothesis that the governance strength increased signaling effects around the repurchase. I mean, stronger results in repurchase firms where executives have their compensation tied to stock performance. I mean, unfortunately, I did not have the opportunity to show the results related to this finding right here. Okay, and finally, the presence of finance and event-driven covenants weakens association between bonds and stock returns. All right. So thank you very much. I mean that probably, like I said, I didn't have time to cover everything, but that's what I have for today. Thank you very much, guys.
That's quite a fast presentation. Thanks for squeezing that much information to this short period of time. For those of you who could not grasp like all of it, I think they're like very good takeaways in the building blocks. Like, why do firms make buybacks? Pedro has a slide. What are the types of covenants? Pedro has a slide. So if you want to investigate that paper by part, so there are many fundamental blocks that Pedro has looked, obviously looked and done in the literature review. And once it's published, I think it's a great source to learn about this area if it's not something you are working on. It's a good entry point just to familiarize with buybacks and covenants. If somebody has a question, please ask. My small question is, there's a lot of work to do on one period of time, but you know, many of the econometrics, if you change the time period, is it something that you look forward to do as an extension sometime, like try to break into periods? Something might have changed in your time within your time period.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, that's a very good question. So for example, in the beginning, I mean, actually this presentation does not include the year of 2020. And the year with all the reactions on the stock market last year was a very important year for buybacks. So definitely going to need to include 2020. I already have the results, but I mean, also the period after the financial crisis 2009. So definitely it's important to split the sample in different time periods just to demonstrate whether the results are robust. Okay, so definitely something that I would like to do as well. Unfortunately, with the trace data set, my sample starts in 2003. I would love to work with more using the 90s, for example. And another thing that is also important to mention is that my trace data set only covers the transactions between U.S. institutions. So unfortunately, I don't have the opportunity to examine this paper to use like international sample. I would love to use, for example, emerging markets, countries like Russia, countries like Brazil, my home country. So I mean, definitely I would love to do maybe in the future, but well, that's a very good
yeah, but it's a good start to, I mean, you would have a good start to your baseline model would be in place, so you could apply it when new data arrives. Yeah, and also that slide where you summarize the data sources is also very useful for us to review. Like we at CMF, we worked with CompuStat, and like not all schools have all the data, and it's good to be able to refer to that list of databases for our educational purposes.
Okay, great. Well, like I said, it's my part of my dissertation. That's the reason why I have so many details. Yeah. But that's it. Thank you very much.